Welcome to today's Explainer. We're covering something absolutely mind-blowing today. Imagine a modern megacorporation, like a massive tech or trading conglomerate, just deciding to raise its own private army and execute a hostile takeover of an entire subcontinent. Sounds like a sci-fi movie plot, right? Well, from 1757 to 1857, the British East India Company did exactly that. They went from a simple trading business to the absolute ruler of India. Today, we are going to break down their exact 100-year playbook.
Okay, so here's our roadmap. We'll break this century of conquest into 6 logical phases. First, the corporate takeover begins. Then, expansion through military force, conquest by clever policies, rewriting the rules, the breaking point in 1857, and finally, how the crown takes control. Let's get right into it. Now, before we look at the how, we really need to look at the why. You might be wondering, how on earth did they pull this off? Well, the British succeeded because they had serious backing. We're talking the immense financial power of the Industrial Revolution, absolute naval superiority, and a hyper-disciplined army. India, on the flip side, was incredibly vulnerable at this specific time. The once mighty Mughal Empire was declining, and that led to massive political fragmentation. Local rulers were locked in mutual rivalries, so this takeover wasn't some random accident. It was a highly strategic exploitation of India's disunity.
Phase 1, the corporate takeover begins with a solid foothold in Bengal.
The East India Company zeroed right in on Bengal. Why? Because it was India's absolute wealthiest province, the dream entry point for a greedy, ambitious corporation. And this hostile takeover happened in 3 distinct steps. First up, 1757, the Battle of Plassey. The company defeated the Nawab, Siraj-ud-Dowlah. But get this, they didn't just win with military muscle. They used shady political intrigue, basically bribing a commander named Mir Jafar to secure the win. Then, moving to 1764, they decisively crushed a combined Indian army at the Battle of Buxar, and that victory led directly to the ultimate prize, the Treaty of Allahabad in 1765. This gave the company Diwani rights, which is literally the legal right to collect Bengal's massive tax revenues. Just like that, military victories started directly funding further corporate expansion. Talk about a self-sustaining business model.
Moving right along to Phase 2, expansion through military force and eliminating rivals.
Okay, so now that the East India Company is completely flushed with Bengal's cash, they can suddenly afford to use pure aggressive muscle to systematically wipe out every major rival power in India. It's a brutal timeline. Over 4 Anglo-Mysore wars, they crushed the fierce resistance of leaders like Tipu Sultan and entirely eliminated French influence down south. Then, they fought the Anglo-Maratha Wars, officially destroying the incredibly formidable Maratha Confederacy by 1818. And finally, through the Anglo-Sikh Wars, they outright annexed Punjab in 1849, pushing their control all the way up to the northwest. For the company, war was literally just the cost of doing business.
Which brings us to Phase 3, conquest by clever policies, or what I like to call the paperwork takeover. Let's be real, wars are wildly expensive and they drain corporate resources fast. So, the company made a strategic pivot to insidious diplomatic manipulation. First up in their tricky new arsenal was the subsidiary alliance, brought in by Lord Wellesley. Honestly, this was a genius, albeit evil move for indirect control. It essentially forced Indian rulers to accept British troops for protection. But here's the kicker. It made the Indian states foot the bill. They also had to host a British resident at their court and completely give up their right to make independent foreign alliances. It stripped these states of their sovereignty while making them actively finance the very military that was subjugating them. And if that wasn't enough, then came the doctrine of lapse, aggressively pushed by Lord Dalhousie. This policy dictated that if an Indian ruler happened to die without a biological heir, boom, their state was automatically absorbed into the British Empire. They flat out refused to recognize adopted sons, which, by the way, was a deeply ingrained Indian tradition. So the crucial takeaway here is that this wasn't even military conquest anymore. It was a manufactured legal loophole used to literally steal entire kingdoms on paper. And the sheer audacity and speed of this policy, it's just staggering. In rapid, almost mechanical succession, the company swallowed up Satara in 1848, Jaipur and Sambalpur in 1849, Udaipur, Jhansi, and Nagpur by 1854. They even went as far as annexing the massive, prosperous state of Awadh in 1856, conveniently claiming misgovernance. This rapid-fire land grab built an intensely deep resentment across the entire subcontinent, massively angering local soldiers and landowners alike. You can just feel the tension building, right? This leads us into Phase 4, rewriting the rules of administration, economics, and society. Securing the land was really just step one. The British also had to rewrite the fundamental economic rules so the entire system served their bottom line. They completely overhauled how money was made. Lord Cornwallis brought in the permanent settlement in Bengal, which created a brand new class of zemindar landlords, all while heavily exploiting the everyday peasants with fixed, crushing revenue demands. In other regions, they used the Raitwari or Maholwari systems to extract taxes directly. But regardless of the system they used, the main function was always exactly the same, guaranteeing the company's massive profit margins. Plus, they actively forced deindustrialization, deliberately flooding the local market with British machine-made goods, which utterly ruined India's incredible traditional handicraft industries. This grim economic reality was perfectly captured later by Dadabhai Naoroji in his famous drain of wealth theory. Now, if you were studying this era, this is an absolutely crucial concept to grasp. Naoroji clearly explained how India wasn't just being governed, it was being systematically bled dry. Through heavily biased trade policies and punishingly high taxation, India's enormous wealth was continuously and deliberately transferred straight to Britain. Make no mistake, this economic bleeding was the ultimate primary goal of the entire colonial enterprise. But hey, they didn't just stop at the economy. They targeted the very fabric of society itself. Wood's Dispatch of 1854, which is often called the Magna Carta of English education in India, along with Macaulay's Minute back in 1835, aggressively pushed Western English education. Why? To create a local compliant class of administrative clerks. At the same time, you had social changes, like the abolition of sati by Lord William Bentinck, which fundamentally disrupted traditional Indian society. Even though the British viewed these as reforms, these acts deeply, deeply unsettled the local population. They genuinely felt like their entire traditional way of life was being permanently erased.
And all of that pressure brings us to Phase 5, the breaking point in 1857. Look, you simply cannot run a pressure cooker of aggressive expansion and ruthless extraction for a solid 100 years without eventually blowing the lid right off the whole thing. Which leads us to a fascinating, critical question. Why did a century of highly successful, highly profitable expansion suddenly explode into a massive, uncontrollable rebellion? Well, it was the ultimate perfect storm. Every single greedy policy we just talked about collided at the exact same time. Politically, the deposed leaders were absolutely furious over those doctrine of lapse annexations. Economically, the peasant class was being completely crushed by relentless taxation. Over in the military, the Indian sepoys were dealing with incredibly low pay, zero chance for promotion, and forced overseas service. And the spark that finally lit the powder keg? The infamous religious controversy over the new rifle cartridges, which were heavily rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat. This triggered intense, widespread fears of forced religious conversion. The resulting explosion saw massive revolt centers spring up all across the north and center of India. You had these truly iconic leaders stepping up to the plate. Bahadur Shah II in Delhi, Nana Sahib in Kanpur, the absolutely legendary Rani Lakshmibai in Jhansi, Begum Hazrat Mahal in Lucknow, and Kunar Singh in Bihar. The rebellion was fierce, it was incredibly bloody, and while it was ultimately brutally suppressed by the British military, it actually succeeded in one massive, game-changing way. It resulted in the total end of the East India Company's rule in India. Which brings us to our final phase, Phase 6. The Crown takes control and the aftermath of the rebellion. The shocking events of 1857 sent massive shockwaves all the way back to London. The British government quickly realized that their little corporate proxy had gone way, way too far. The immediate aftermath was the Government of India Act in 1858. With this sweeping legislation, rule was officially stripped from the East India Company and transferred directly to the British Crown. A Secretary of State was created over in London, and the Governor-General in India was swapped out for a viceroy who served as the direct representative of the monarch. The era of the trading corporation was over. India was now formally a state-run colony of the British Empire. As we wrap up this explainer, let's just take a step back and look at the sheer scale of this 100-year timeline. In 1757, the whole thing started with a single, politically manipulated military victory at Plassey. By 1765, they'd grabbed the right to collect taxes. Jump to 1818, they'd entirely eliminated their major rivals, the Marathas. And it all crested in the massive, explosive revolt of 1857, which fundamentally ended the era of corporate rule and ushered in direct British Crown rule by 1858. It is just a breathtaking century of systematic expansion and exploitation. So I want to leave you with this final thought.
It's actually a classic debate among historians. Knowing this deeply systematic history of calculated military force, devastating economic drain, and insidious political manipulation, do you think the events of 1857 were simply a disorganized military mutiny? Or was it in fact India's first true war of independence? Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. Keep analyzing, keep questioning, and I'll catch you